To repeat a point I'm sure I've made before, arcade ports for consoles in the 80s and early 90s were always a tricky undertaking, because in terms of raw power, there was such a yawning gap between the arcade hardware and consoles of that era that they almost inevitably dictated a degree of compromise. Often, the problem posed by a coin-op conversion was how to translate it as accurately as possible to a new host platform. Not so much of an issue if the hardware was comparatively powerful, but sometimes there were unavoidable issues to work around. Any given console's controller layout might not accommodate a more complex control scheme, or the hardware might simply be incapable of reproducing certain key effects and unique selling points. In hindsight, it's sometimes astounding how well developers were able to get around these issues and bring high-quality ports to home systems. But then, sometimes, you'd get conversions that seemed substandard for no good reason, where no apparent problems existed, and surely all that was needed was a bit of common sense, smart decision making, and clever coding to make them work. Sadly, this is the territory we're in when we look back at the Master System port of Vigilante, a game that really ought to work, but for reasons I'll get into, just doesn't. Vigilante first hit arcades in 1988, courtesy of Irem, who I'll always remember for their legendary side-scrolling shooter R-Type. To this day, the company are probably better known for games of that ilk, if not the majestic franchise R-Type itself would blossom into. So to see them turn their hand to a side-on brawler is kind of interesting, if nothing else. As I recall, the Vigilante coin-op made a bit of a name for itself thanks to its speedy, fluid style of play and its visuals, which called to mind the chop-socky action of contemporary kung fu movies. And at first glance, it seems like this port, by Arc System Works, does a decent job of aping the stylings of its coin-guzzling parent machine. It's as simple to play as you'd expect this kind of game to be. Each of its 5 stages sees you taking on an assortment of thugs as you fight your way toward an end boss, armed, at least initially, with nothing but your hands and feet. One of the dinky Master System controller's buttons doles out punches, the other unleashes kung fu kicks, and you can execute either as a low attack while crouching. Pressing both buttons together allows you to jump, and occasionally you'll happen upon a pair of nunchucks that some kind soul has thoughtfully left laying around for you to make use of. These dish out a more powerful attack than your kicks and punches, but they're prone to flying out of your hands if you take a punch. This game displays its arcade roots unapologetically, being both simple and brutal. All the action takes place on a single plane, and enemy attacks are designed to wear your health bar down at a rate of knots, an obvious holdover from the arcade machine's mandate to liberate players from their spare change as quickly as possible. There are no health pickups to be found in-game, and a favourite tactic of the thugs you'll meet in each stage is to mob you and catch you in a grapple, which wears your health down quickly until you can shake them off with a rapid left to right D-pad waggle. Other enemies will try to outsmart you with stop and start movement patterns, some will try to shank you with a blade or beat you with a stick, and a few will even pull a gun on you. Considering the game's age, there's a decent variety of different enemy attacks to keep players on their toes. But really, the way the game employs them all means the whole thing basically boils down to a test of your reflexes. Which is something I guess you could say about a lot of video games. It's just that, in this case, it's not an especially appealing one. If you saw my review of Altered Beast for the Sega Mega Drive, you'll know that I'm not the biggest fan of these kinds of 2D brawlers. They're just not my bag, and to make an impression with me, they really need to do something special. And Vigilante, sad to say, just doesn't bring anything remarkable to the table. It's not a game I feel has aged at all well, unfortunately, and it doesn't help either that this Master System conversion is technically a pretty ropey recreation of it. One of the most noticeable downgrades the game suffered for being ported to Sega's 8-bit console is that it doesn't have quite the same pacey feel of the original. It feels noticeably slower to play, which puts a dent in its appeal, and the Master System can't hope to capture all of the coin-op's presentational frills, so all of its sampled sounds and speech are absent. Accuracy freaks will notice some other presentational changes as well. For example, even though the game preserves the short cutscenes before each stage, the text has been altered. So Madonna, the damsel in distress who represents your endgame objective in the coin-op, is now Maria, and the skinheads who made off with her are now referred to as rogues, which I must admit I do like the sound of much better. Players are also told in the game's brief intro that only they can get Maria back, as opposed to being encouraged to take the law into their own hands. It's a minor thing, but you can tell that somebody was really concerned with taking the edge off the game's premise of an ordinary Joe citizen illegally taking up arms against the criminal element in his city. There are other, more impactful changes here as well though, like this one. Once you get to the boss fight at the end of stage 2, you'll notice that's been quite substantially altered. Whereas in the coin-op and other conversions of the game, you fight 2 acrobatic bosses at this point, on the Master System, there's just one. I'm not sure why this is the case, because it seems to me that the console should be powerful enough to handle putting 3 characters on screen, but for whatever reason, it's now a strictly mano-a-mano encounter. Tweaks and inaccuracies like this are the kind of thing I could live with if the soul and feel of the game were properly preserved. But even allowing for the fact that these kinds of side-on brawlers aren't really my cup of tea, Vigilante on the Master System feels like a bit of a broken port, because, frankly, it's a real struggle to actually play. This kind of game needs fluid controls to be enjoyable, but in this case, they're anything but. D-pad control is sloppy, making it very easy to end up facing the wrong way when you need to take out an enemy quickly. And there's a very real problem when it comes to executing the mid-air attacks you could pull off in the coin-op, by which I mean it's a miracle if you can get them to work. And when they do, it's usually by accident more than design. Really, that's unforgivable, because there are certain parts of the game, like the opening of stage 3, where you meet enemies on motorcycles, where you really need mastery of flying kicks to progress. This detail infuriates me, because, to be blunt about it, there's simply no good reason for these sloppy control issues to exist. I'm usually loath to bring up the point that a better version of any given game might be available on another console, but it's hard to play Vigilante on the Master System without being reminded of its PC Engine conversion, which I'm more familiar with. That was handled directly by Irem themselves, and it works a lot better. The really damning thing is, if you take a look at both versions of the game side by side, and the consoles they were designed for, you see just how far this Sega port falls short. The PC Engine and Master System controllers have a near identical D-pad and button layout, yet Vigilante on the PC Engine manages to work without the awkwardness of using 2 buttons to jump, and leaping attacks are much easier to pull off. So you have to wonder why Arc System Works thought it was a good idea to use the clunky control scheme in place here. Then again, I get the impression Vigilante might have been something of a rush release, because it has more problems besides horrible controls. Hit detection is laughably imprecise, and sees you and your enemies taking damage from punches that you can see are landing in dead air, and enemy AI is ridiculously poor. You can avoid a good number of the game's rank and file thugs just by jumping over them, whereupon they'll simply continue walking in the direction they were going before, leaving you free to go about your business. Arc System Works deserves some praise for at least making Vigilante a recognisable conversion of Irem's original arcade game. That's no mean feat. But unfortunately, it seems like more time and effort went into dressing this conversion up to make it look the part than was spent actually playtesting it before release. And what we're left with is a game that feels like it needed another few runs through the quality control wringer before it made it as far as being pressed into cartridge form. Admittedly, I doubt I'd actually enjoy it any more if it was a more tidily made effort, because, to repeat this point, it's just not my kind of game. I find fixed plane brawlers to generally be a bit too simplistic for my tastes. The thing is though, even a simple game needs to be better realised than this, especially if it requires precision and quick reactions from the player, and the combination of duff controls and dodgy hit detection afflicting this port are enough to really hurt it. Because of that, it's certainly not a game I'd recommend, even for fans of the genre.